I've only just started reading Robert Sawyer, and I've become a huge fan, He seems to be another one of those Canadians who's famous everywhere except here at home. What caught my eye was one of his more recent novels. It's called Hominid. It's available in the bookshop, and it's set in Sudbury, Sandra Shamus's hometown. Sandra, you here? All right. And it's set in and around the Sudbury Neutrino Observatory, a story that is extremely believable. The fascinating premise of the story is that, contrary to reigning theory, the Neanderthals were not, in fact, wiped out by our own species, but live in a parallel universe on this Earth where they have developed art and science and a form of social organization which appears to be considerably superior to our own. So, Robert, I know you have that little problem.
Yes.
Can I give you a hand?
Thank you, Moses.
Yeah, there you go.
And thank you.
All right, Robert Sawyer.
Thank you very much, Moses. Thank you. Noticed that I didn't have a crutch yesterday. I see there are not too many people sitting up in the balcony today, but I warn you to be careful as you come down from the balcony. I missed a step. I was fascinated by the wonderful Macintosh computers scattered all over the entryway, the foyer, and one of them caught my eye as I was coming down, and I missed the last step, and I fell and I hurt my leg. And I was thinking, the only thing wrong with IdeaCity is that it's not in the United States, because were it in the United States, I'd now be set for life because of my own clumsiness. But nonetheless, I will forge ahead, and I thought I would sit down, but I'm actually feeling pretty good. I think I'm going to try and stand. I hope you'll forgive me if I waddle a little bit as I do this. I'm delighted to be asked to speak here today, and I am a science fiction writer, and I'm very passionate about science fiction as a literature, and I underscore the word literature because what I'm going to be talking about today is not generally what people whose only exposure to science fiction has been film and television think of science fiction as being about. There are some very good science fiction movies and some very good science fiction TV series, but the majority of what you see these days in the movie theaters and on TV is aimed at teenage boys and is action-adventure and is an excuse for special effects technicians to show off the brilliance of their craft at the expense possibly of any sort of real thoughtful entertainment. I don't like the name science fiction. It's a historical reality that we're stuck with it. A fellow named Hugo Gernsback, who founded the first science fiction magazine in 1926, coined the term, and it sort of has stuck. He is responsible for two things that have stuck. Back in 1926, he paid 3 cents a word for science fiction stories, a rate that we still use today, and he gave the genre a name that we're also still stuck with today. But many of my colleagues and myself actually prefer a term, the literature of ideas, which is wonderfully appropriate for being here at IdeaCity. Oh, and before I go further, I got to point something out. Most of you are Canadians, because there are a few foreigners who won't recognize this. But everybody knows the National Film Board of Canada logo, which is that guy, that little stick man with an eye for a head. I have noticed sitting here in the front row, as I'm privileged to do today because I'm speaking today, the 03 looks an awful lot like the wife of the National Film Board man, if you stare at it long enough there. So I was kind of surprised to see that there, but it's a nice little touch. Michael, who spoke before me, might know whether this is true or not. I'm told that Albert Einstein is the father of the quote related to the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, that there are only two possible answers to the question of whether or not aliens exist. Either they do or they don't. There are only two possible answers, and both answers are astonishing. And in my last couple of books of science fiction, I have been quite intrigued by a similar big idea question, which is whether or not a God exists. Not whether or not the Judeo-Christian God of the Bible exists, but whether or not we live in a universe that was, in fact, created. And I came to this sort of area of interest as somebody who believes in the supremacy of science. And it occurs to me that if you follow through a chain of argument, you end up with an argument that might in fact lead to a good thought experiment that might say that this universe this universe had an intelligent designer. And that the thought experiment idea, the idea of Gedanken, which is a German word for thought experiment, is very much what science fiction tries to do, conduct experiments that we don't yet have the science and technology to do in day-to-day life. And the little thought experiment was this. Right now, we know that our technology is accelerating at a great pace. We know that Moore's law, which is the law that says the number of semiconductors you can cram on a chip is going to increase every 18 months, double every 18 months, excuse me, has been holding steady for an awfully long time. So we know that computer technology is going to get more and more powerful. Our technology is going to get more and more powerful. Moses alluded to the fact that in several billion years, the Andromeda galaxy will intercept our galaxy. That is true. Even longer in the future than that, 12 to 20 billion years in the future, the universe will just run out of steam. We used to think that the universe started in a big bang and then was going to fall back in a big crunch. The current thinking is it started in a big bang and it's just going to peter out, and we'll have what has the lovely name of the heat death of the universe, which is kind of like August in Toronto, I imagine. What we want to do is say that at some point we're going to have to address that problem. We may not be able to do anything about Andromeda coming in because we only got 4 billion years to prepare for that. But we've got 20 billion years to prepare for the end of the universe. And it's conceivable that at the end of the universe, we will have, if Moore's law holds and all this stuff holds, enormously powerful technology for simulating things in computers. And I shouldn't say that because it might be actionable. An interesting physicist wrote a book. Now I won't even mention his name because of the way I introduced him, but those in the audience will know who he is. Wrote a book called The Physics of Immortality a few years ago that was enormously popular with science fiction fans and readers and writers, and looked askance at by a lot of people in the science fiction, in the science field. But he said basically, as our computer technology develops, we will eventually have enough computing power to simulate anything we want on a computer. And he said, of course, in the far future, he had this bizarre theory that some computer would want to simulate all of us and we would be reborn, resurrected inside a computer. I don't think that's necessarily true or of any interest to anybody, but I do know that students in the far future will be making artificial universes in laboratories. I think it's inevitable that cosmology students will actually have practical projects they'll have to do once we have the capability for them to do practical projects. So they will be creating little universes and so forth. And it's conceivable then that we, or our distant descendants, will be creating universes. And if you take it back a step, it means, of course, that we might be the created project of some high school or university student from billions of years more advanced technology. Now, is there any evidence that this might be the case? There actually is some evidence. There's also a get-out-of-jail-free card for those who don't want to believe the evidence, and I'll go into both of those and say I did a novel 2 years ago that was set right across the street at the Royal Ontario Museum. Some of you might know it. It's called Calculating God. It was about an alien who came to Toronto looking for scientific proof for the existence of an intelligent designer of the universe. And in that novel, I argued for the possibility that there was an intelligent designer of the universe. And there's a recipe that makes up this universe. There's, in fact, 4 fundamental forces that are responsible for defining how this universe works. There's electromagnetism, there's gravity, which we're familiar with both of those because we have day-to-day interaction with them. I'm held here and fell down yesterday because of gravity, and you can see me because of electromagnetism, because of the photons falling on me from these lights. There's also the strong nuclear force, which is what allows those positively charged protons in the cores of atoms to stay together without repelling each other. They're both, it's like putting 2 positive magnet poles together. You can't do it normally. There is a force that acts at very short distances that allows you to pack protons together. And then there's a weak nuclear force that's responsible for some kinds of radioactive decay. That formula for this universe, you could define the formula for this universe as the ratio between those 4 forces, how relatively strong one is to the other. And just to bring it into a realm that we're all familiar with, let's talk about gravity. We do know that our universe started with a Big Bang. That's almost without question in physics communities, although there's some interesting guys, Halton Arp is one, who thinks that's not true, but most guys, most physicists, accept the Big Bang theory. I used to have a problem with a part of the Big Bang theory, which is called hyperinflation, which is kind of a fudge factor put in there to explain the uniformity of what we see in the universe. And it causes, after the initial explosion of the Big Bang, for there to be a period of very rapid expansion. But yesterday, when I saw how fast my ankle welled up after falling down the stairs, I realized that hyperinflation actually is quite possible, because I've now been empirical proof that it can happen. But if you take gravity as one that we are familiar with, the force of gravity, the value of the force of gravity, how strong it is intimately related to whether or not this universe would exist in such a state that would give rise to complex chemistry, which is what all of us are. If the force of gravity had been just a little bit stronger than it actually was, a tiny fraction of its value stronger than it actually was, after the Big Bang, after the initial explosion, which created the universe, that force of gravity would have gathered everything back into the opposite of a Big Bang is a big crunch, and everything would have fallen back in. We wouldn't have a universe that right now is about, plus or minus, depending on who you listen to, about 12 billion years old, with our planet being 4.5 billion years old. It would have just, if it had been just a little bit stronger, it would have collapsed right back down, just like throwing a ball up in the air and it drops down. If it had been a little bit weaker than it actually is, then after the explosion, everything would have continued to dissipate, and you never would have got the coalescence of gas clouds that ultimately gave rise to stars and their attendant planetary bodies and so forth. So there is a school of thought that says, given that there are only these four numbers that describe a universe, the relationship of these four forces, and if you look at them individually and the effect they have on the fact that we have a universe that's capable of sustaining complex biology for long periods of time, i.e. the universe we live in, there are those who argue that the relationship and the strengths, relative strengths of the four forces must have been fine-tuned or jiggered by somebody or something. And that argument is actually quite interesting, because there is a lot of evidence, and you can go on for length about all sorts of interesting little picayune details of how this universe works that do seem to be the ideal values for long-term existence of a complex chemical environment in which life might arise. That said, now here's the get-out-of-jail-free card. It only is true that it's somewhat miraculous, and I use that word advisedly in this context, if, in fact, this is the only universe that exists, or one of only a handful of universes that have existed. If there's a panoply of universes, an infinite variety of parallel universes, or of universes that existed prior to this one, and they all have subtly different fundamental constants, then there's nothing remarkable about one of them coming up with the right roll of the dice to make us possible. And then there would be gazillions of others in which human life, complex chemistry, even stars and planets, letting alone life in them, would not be possible. So that's the get-out-of-jail-free card, whether or not other universes have existed or do exist parallel to ours that have different physical laws. You don't get out of jail free if there are a bazillion universes that all have the same physical laws, because then the same jiggering argument applies. And I found this a fascinating question, and science fiction was a great model, a great mode for exploring a question like that. So in Calculating God, I argued, well, maybe this is worth looking at as a scientific theory. I don't have a position one way or another. I think it would only be an act of faith and of arrogance to say, yes, I know whether or not we're the product of some advanced high school student who got maybe, as Derek was saying, these are the worst times he's seen in his life. So I'm not going to say he got an A+ on his project, but he might have got a C- for creating this particular universe that we live in. I think that's plausible, but we don't know one way or another, and it's worthy of investigation. That said, the other thing that science fiction allows you to do is argue both sides of an issue, and you get to do it with impunity in a way that a working scientist doesn't get to do, and I'm by no means a scientist. I consider myself an artist, not a scientist. But a working scientist has to publish his or her doctoral dissertation and then basically stick to it, despite what evidence comes as time goes on, and say, yes, I know there's less and less evidence to support my position, but boy, I'm still fighting for it. And in an area that, as Moses indicated, I've just written actually a trilogy of books about Neanderthals. The first one, Hominids, is out in paperback now. Second one, Humans, is out in hardcover, and the third one comes out at Christmas. And a large part of it's set at the Sudbury Neutrino Observatory, which you're going to hear about from Tony, our next speaker. And I wanted to explore, actually, in the trilogy, Hominids, Humans, and Hybrids, why it is that we're predisposed to believe in a God. And there's some interesting neuropsychology, of course, that's come out in the last few years, and figures actually prominently in my third book by coincidence, because I took the Sudbury Neutrino Observatory as the staging for where a portal opened up to an alternative reality where Neanderthals survived to the present day. As it happens, Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario, is the hotbed of research into the neuropsychology of the human brain that gives rise to religious belief as well as to UFO abduction phenomenon belief. A scientist there named Michael Persinger has done some astonishing research in that area that says, basically that he can stimulate your brain electrically and get you to have an out-of-body experience, a religious encounter experience, or an alien encounter experience, depending on what your cultural predisposition is. And that's an interesting line of reasoning that I like to explore in these novels, but I'm also very interested in what I think is the fundamental psychological reason why it is that we're predisposed to believe in God, whether or not God actually exists. And it has to do with something everybody learns in first-year psychology class, I think. This is my notion anyways. Notion, as they say on the Royal Canadian Air Force. There's CBC has a radio series called Ideas. Notions are things that aren't big enough to be ideas. So this is my notion about this issue. My notion is that you learn in first-year psychology that the best reinforcement schedule in terms of training somebody to have a behavior is not what you would think it would be, which is consistent reinforcement. That is, if you do this, I will give you a cookie. Or if you do this, I'll let you stay up late. If you clean your room, I'll let you stay up late and watch TV or whatever, if you're a kid. What works best in human beings, and it's been shown time and time again, is intermittent reinforcement. A behavior becomes absolutely unextinguishable in us if it is intermittently reinforced. The reason kids whine to their parents and say, will you buy me a toy, will you buy me a toy, will you buy me a toy, when they're out shopping, is not because it works every time. If it worked every time, it would be boring for us. What's fascinating to us is it might work this time, sometimes it does, and it's irresistible, just as gambling is irresistible. We have this desire to keep testing to see if the notion of there being an influence to reality that we can exert actually is true or not. And certainly, if you look at the things that happened in primitive times that engendered in us the belief in God, every culture has some version, every early tribal culture has some version of the rain dance or something similar, which is designed to affect the weather. And it doesn't work the first 8 or 10 times, and then the 11th time it rains. And you say, see, it works, right? Not that this is totally and completely coincidental. You end up saying, see, this works. That's ingrained in our psychology, that God listens. We weren't worthy the first 8 or 9 times. The 10th time, we were worthy. And then the 11th through 20th time, or 30th or 40th time, well, we're screwing up in some other way. The ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card on the flip side for those who want to believe that there is a intelligent design or a guiding force in the universe is that famous saying, God works in mysterious ways. It means there doesn't have to be any rational basis on what happens. You can say, no, he's working in mysterious ways. That's okay. I'm getting the yellow light here, so I just want to wrap up by saying the Neanderthals, who I deal with a great deal in this series, overlapped us for about 10,000 years. Neanderthals first appeared about 200,000 years ago, and they died out about 30,000 years ago. We, Homo sapiens appeared about 100,000 years ago, and of course survived to the present day. But we entered the same territories as the Neanderthals about 40,000 years ago. There's 10,000 years where we essentially lived side by side. During that time, we had 40,000 years ago as the magic date. We started having religious beliefs. We know that from the fossil record, or the archaeological record, because we started burying our dead with what archaeologists call grave goods, which are things that could only be of use in a putative afterlife. In a tight economy, you don't take your best spear or your best piece of food and put it in the ground with a dead guy. You save it for yourself, unless you think that dead guy is really going to need it wherever he's going. At the same time, Neanderthals were burying their dead as well, and they were doing it the way you know, you do it if you're at summer camp and it's your job to dig the latrine. You make the smallest possible hole possible, and then you cram the body in there. Neanderthal bodies actually get crammed down into holes in the ground. There used to be some belief in the 70s that Neanderthals adorned their bodies with flowers, when they dead bodies with flowers. And that's been completely discredited in the fossil record, in the paleoanthropological community. Because in the archaeological record, yes, there's flower pollen at the level you find the Neanderthal burials at. There's flower pollen at every level. It just percolates in with the groundwater. And if you look everywhere, it's everywhere. If you only look where the Neanderthal bodies are, it seems to only be there. The same thing is with the cult of the cave bear. There is no Neanderthal religion as far as we can tell. The cave bear skulls are just skulls that have been kicked to the side of bears that had died during hibernation prior to the occupation by Neanderthals. So we had two types of human beings, and living side by side, one that became predisposed to believe in God, one that didn't become predisposed to believe in God. And I suspect if a Neanderthal child was whining to its mother and said, please, please, please let me have this little thing I want to play with, and the mother said no 3 or 4 times, the Neanderthal child would have given up. And because there's no native logic to the belief in a higher power. You either believe it or you don't. And science fiction, to draw it to a conclusion here, is what lets you have that mind field actually, to play games of intellectual experiments about really deep philosophical questions. And that's why I'm so passionate about writing it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.